Shiloh Halsey, thank you so much for being on Transcending Politics, brother. How you doing today?
Great.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Hey, I first of all, I want to tell the audience that there's something a little bit serendipitous about our conversation here today, because I was talking to an individual. As a matter of fact, our first interview for Transcending Politics conducted just a couple of days ago with a guy named Dan Koch from the Depolarized podcast. Are you familiar with Dan by any chance?
No.
So you'll want to check out the Depolarized podcast. I mean, he's got a great program where he brings together voters from across the spectrum, sort of a faith-based angle and so forth, Christian element. But I mean, his whole mission is about bridging the divide and using his podcast to show people the actual human face of folks with various political perspectives. But he's a musician, and music was a big part of how he got to discover his passion for depolarization. And I asked him how that came about, and part of his answer was that in the recording studio, he would have political conversations with the musicians and the engineers and so forth, and they would start arguing back and forth with each other. And he'd kind of play the referee, and then he realized, I'm pretty good at this too, or this is something I'd like to take to another level. So I'm a musician myself. Well, I probably shouldn't claim that, although I do. I come from a musical family. I'm a trumpet player, singer. My father's a pianist. My mother's an R&B singer, et cetera, et cetera. Music has worked its way into my social mission in different ways. And I know that you're an artist yourself.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to know, first of all, we want to talk about bridging our divide and so forth, and how you got to the point of wanting to be a depolarizer yourself and a person who helps us communicate across these difficult ideological and partisan barriers. But what did that process look like for you? And is there any connection to your background as an artist, if you can explain that a little bit as well?
Yeah. Well, my experience with music as it relates to this kind of work, there is no connection that I've seen. The only connection that one could draw is just the building of a family. But it more accurately parallels a relationship.
Okay, well, there goes my hypothesis, but that's fine.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, I see the band as and I play in bands. That's generally what I've done. A little bit of classical music, but it's generally trying to keep everyone happy, including yourself. So one could draw a parallel there to political depolarization, but it's less so for me.
Sure, not a problem. So in that case, what was the particular route that you took to this place where you're at now with your current mission?
Yeah, well, I think I've always had a sense of interest in you could say a mediator perspective, kind of a mediation role. And not to say I'm particularly skilled at it all the time, but I've often had that focus and been interested in that. Where is maybe the middle ground, or where are two people speaking and missing each other?
Right.
That's something that's always been of interest to me. Through my work as an environmental scientist, I work on collaboratives, and through that work, we work on timber sale planning, restoration planning with local community members, county commissioners, and myself as a conservationist. And so I've had to move around different parts of the state for different projects and come to common agreement, understanding on contentious issues. Logging and timber is a heartfelt, you could almost say passion for many communities, because it's really how many communities were built. And they've seen that go away. And then you have conservation groups, such as the ones that I represent, come in with all the answers. And so navigating that definite polarized system is an interesting and beneficial process for me.
I can imagine. So I'm a real city slicker out here in Los Angeles, and I have to admit, we don't know too much about timber out here.
Yeah.
Heck, we barely know anything. We barely know anything about firewood. The fireplaces are mostly electric and
right.
different parts of the city. But that's a fascinating thing, and for me, it highlights the fact that one of the perhaps one of the best anecdotes to an ideologically polarized perspective on things is the actual assuming of responsibility in one's life, particularly where those responsibilities overlap with a need to actually collaborate with a diverse number of people. Because it's sort of easy for us to, sit back, listen to the radio, watch TV, and throw stones at pundits and, at politicians in Congress for not getting the job done. We're not in the job. It's not to say that we don't have every right and reason to be thoroughly disappointed with our elected officials. I mean, I certainly, feel much of that, and I imagine you probably do too. But at the same time, I mean, democracy is supposed to be very much a collaborative process. And on any serious enterprise, I mean, whether you're trying to run a school or a business or in the field of work that you're involved in, it seems inevitable that for something to function properly, you've got to have the humility to say, well, this is my opinion, this is my approach, but let me be flexible because I'm working with somebody else who has something else to offer here, and I've got to bend a little bit to see, to see how we can get it done together. Yeah, exactly. Now, when did what was the sort of proximate cause or starting point for the establishing of bridging our divide?
Well, as far as the win, it was about a year ago.
Mm.
Excuse me.
And go ahead and explain a little bit too for people who don't know just precisely what bridging our divide focuses on.
Yeah. So what we do is we host events to bring people together who hold different perspectives, ideologically or politically, to bring them together for conversation and a good time. Memorable, enjoyable experience. So our main focus is two types of events: community dialogue events, which involve local community members coming together, small group discussions, and those are taking place throughout the country. The other is common ground debates, and we're having our first common ground debate in about 2 weeks. That's a little bit different in that we bring in, you could say, experts or people that work in certain fields that represent two different sides of an issue. And the issue can change. The issue could be immigration, it could be tax policy, it could be climate change, it could be identity politics in the case of this first event. And we bring in...
I think I'm going to have a pretty good seat for that one. I
think you will, as the moderator.
There we go, yeah.
Looking forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, yeah.
And so the point of that is that, you see things such as Intelligence Squared debates, that's a fantastic program, and other kinds of debates. You see these debates around, and I, for one, often feel like I'm not getting the full picture. Each side wants to win, and each side does not give an inch to that middle area, whatever it may be. Maybe it's on a certain particular aspect of the topic, or maybe it's an overarching perspective that they're just not bridging. They're not putting together.
Right.
There's no incentive to. The incentive is to win. And I get that. And I still find value in that. But I think at this time in our country, and at this time in our political situation, I think it's valuable to have a different forum as well. A forum where you bring together people that are experts in a field or have a lot of experience in a certain field to have a conversation, to bring their different perspectives, but to focus that conversation on a path forward, common ground, shared values, whatever it may be, and have a moderator and to have questions designed to bring that out of the speakers and to have that be the spirit of the event. Those are the two events.
Gotcha. On the Bridging Our Divide website, there's a brief passage here which I think summarizes the mission pretty eloquently, and I want to expand upon it. It says we need to work together to improve communication between people with different ideologies and different visions of America, because, quote, our core values and needs overlap more than they differ, unquote. And I thought that said a mouthful, because that's precisely what perhaps we are losing in our common understanding of the American community. I mean, if you look at the constituencies on the left and on the right. I think it's increasingly fair to say that there's a underlying sense that folks on the other side of that aisle really are not part of the same community as our people within our own political universe, or our own political tribe, more properly stated. And so I can hear, in listening to you speak, sort of what Bridging Our Divides approaches for trying to cultivate a renewed appreciation for our common values and so forth. Do you have any particular feeling or sense, however, as to how we got to this place of profound polarization in the first place? And to sharpen the question, is it something that's completely new to American politics? Is this something that's always been a problem and just looks different nowadays? What gives the problem its shape today, as you see it?
Yeah. So, well, first on the historical aspect, there are many people that know much more than I do about that. Obviously, we've been similarly as polarized in the past, whether that be the Civil War, the Vietnam era, or other times that maybe get less press about that. I think it has a different flavor now, and potentially a different danger, in that the spread of information and the geographic and ideologic divisions are more solid. I think they're more difficult to pierce. We don't have that same type of neighborhood community due to how we've moved ourselves into different areas of this country.
Right.
And increasingly the same can be said for the digital interactions that we have. I think, Better Angels and other groups and individuals are becoming more aware of that, and I think working to create a better system. But it's a lot to push up against, because the forces really are against us in that respect, in that division sells. It's a lot easier to push something across that's passionately driven, fear driven, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And expressing a passion for unity. Well, that sounds great. It doesn't necessarily have the same ring. It's a longer term conversation. It's a longer term battle, you could say. So I think in that sense, it's a little different. Now, what was the other part of your question?
Well, in part, you answered it. I mean, looking at the historical context of things and so forth, I suppose the other part of it is, has this always been a problem, or is this just completely new in our time? I mean, I think that's an important thing to think about, because, the answer to that question may round out the perspective with which we take to it, because, it's funny. Now, by the way, how old are you, Shiloh?
38.
Right. Yeah, I'm 31. So, we're relatively young. I've talked to people, though, who are, baby boomers and so forth, some of whom will say that, this is a uniquely, divisive period in our time. And then others who will say, well, wait a second, we had the Watts riots in '68 and so forth, And so, I know that your point for jumping into this topic may not be a complete focus on the historical context of it and so forth. But do you think that this is do you think that this is novel or cyclical in terms of, it being a phenomenon of American life?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think getting back to what I was saying about how this has been a feature of a growing society. Yeah. There are different threats that exist now that might not have existed at other times. And it's obviously might be easier now to gloss over things that true fears of the past, but we have all that existed back then. Maybe that's nuclear power or this or that, and the divisions that existed before that, maybe geographically speaking, and now we have the situation with the digital experience, you know, the AI, you could say. Obviously, I don't want to get into that rabbit hole, but a variety of things. I don't want to, you know, kind of go down a fear mongering route either. But I think the threats are a little different, and so it's cyclical, but it's certainly different. And I think it came out of a strongly divisive, I almost want to say moment, but, you know, during the 2008 time when Obama was elected, you saw something ramp up, and maybe that was something that was just becoming more obvious at the time. But I think that was a dramatic step. You know, maybe there were other steps occurring right before that and right after, but that was a big step. And I would say there were camps that were, you know, created and more entrenched at that time. It was pretty unfortunate, and whether it was based in political things or racism, it's probably a mix of many things. But I think we've gone into battles from that, and much of what we see today is a result of that, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because your characterization of the 2008, the environment of 2008, I definitely see your point with respect to that. Although when I think of the 2008 campaign and compare it to 2016, I'm struck by what seemed to be just the incredible reversal of the what I thought to be the overarching tone of American politics from the Obama campaign to the Trump campaign. So, I mean, certainly we saw vicious divisions, you know, begin to reveal themselves and to become more pronounced during the Obama administration. And I should mention that, you know, I mean, you know, much of the audience will know, but I am a Republican now, a registered Republican, but I worked for Senator Obama's campaign in 2008 and was greatly inspired by the message of hope and change. It seemed to me at that time that you had Americans of both different colors and even to a certain degree of some varying ideological perspectives coming together underneath or within the sort of this transformative theme of, you know, hope and change, but also the idea of our embracing a post-partisan, post-racial sort of American politics, political society. And, you know, those ideas still inspire me, even as I've shifted on a lot of particular policy issues. The Trump campaign couldn't have been more the opposite of hope and change, I thought. I mean, his inaugural address was really remarkable. I think he talked about the carnage of American cities and so forth, and you hear him talk about the hell of Chicago. And, you know, I'm not really trying to make this point about Trump per se, although he's certainly been the agent, I think, for a fair amount of division. Whether you supported him or not, I don't think it's unfair to say that. But I would be curious to sort of jump from one side of this equation to the other and to get your take. First of all, how would you describe, well, let's start with this. First of all, how would you tend to describe your personal politics? I know that you're seeking to build bridges, as am I, but we're also both individuals. And I just wonder, for yourself, you know, how would you outline your general political point of view?
Yeah. Well, I come from what you call a progressive or left-leaning background. I mean, that's generally how I was considering myself for many years. And I think over the past 5 to 8 years, started to see more a broader perspective, more of the values on each side of that. And so at this point, I'd say I still probably left-leaning, but I see much value on right-leaning policy initiatives. And, you know, I tend not to, the word centrist is a little, I think carries a lot of ambiguity that's not helpful. So I won't go there. But
I actually don't mind the phrase centrist for myself. I mean, I definitely consider myself to be a person who leans right all in all things taken together, although I definitely have some left-leaning perspectives as well. The way I define centrism is sort of just the recognition that at the end of the day, the business of governing and advancing society takes place in the middle. And the middle can shift from one direction or the other. But eventually, after we have our debates and our conversations, when it comes time to make a decision, I feel like the productive thing to do is usually to look for the optimal compromise, right?
Yeah.
Which sort of means that, the importance of finding a center space has to be front and center in our minds. So that's sort of how I see it. But having,
yeah,
I
think it's a valuable perspective. I think the ambiguity though is tough because
not everybody has
which
that definition.
part of the center, For instance, I come at it with a more of a liberal perspective on social issues, maybe understanding a lot of the value of the right-leaning perspectives of economics and things like that.
Yeah, and not to get off on too much of a tangent on this point, but before I jump to the other thing, I wanted to ask something you said did strike me. Your background is in environmental science, and you're a person who may perhaps be generally left-leaning, but has come to appreciate more and more perspectives on the right. Are there any right-leaning perspectives that you think have value in the realm of environmental issues in general? Because I think that's an area where folks on the left, it's a particular area where folks on the left see nothing of value coming from the right on. And so I'm just wondering,
for sure. I think there's a lot to be said for what you could say is maybe a right-leaning perspective on environmental issues. I think environmental kind of conversations on these things are a great arena from which to kind of view some of the stuff, because in many of the situations I've been in, I'm bringing what you would say maybe a left-leaning perspective to environmental conversations, but someone coming from the right, or maybe the more and you could say old-fashioned, because the way we've interacted with our land, and whether that be like timber or the streams, is one of kind of ownership. This is my property, this is my area, I do this, I do that. And while that's easy to belittle, I think there's some value there too, and to understand why that came about. I mean, whether it's that frontier mentality or a community heritage, a feeling of community heritage.
Right.
I see a lot of value in that, and I see my role as an environmental scientist to try to bridge that gap and to maintain ecologically sound policies and projects, while also understanding the economic needs of local communities and the economic perspectives and the emotional value that these kinds of conversations represent for the people that are different from myself.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny, the geographical differences in our circumstances really does require us to sort of step out of ourselves a little bit to understand some of these sorts of contexts. Because again, as a person who's grown up in a very urban setting, I have very little native sense of what exactly you're talking about, although I understand what you're saying intellectually, and have studied a little bit, what life is like in rural areas and the issue of conservation. I'm by no means an expert, but it does sort of drive home this idea that we need to really sort of, I guess, take it upon ourselves to empathize with the sort of cultural experiences of different groups of people to understand how it is they view certain policy and political issues. But I think it's fascinating to hear you sort of articulate a pro-environmental perspective that does attribute some credibility to certain right-leaning themes.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a little story about a moment when I think started to see that dynamic and that situation a little bit differently. It was, I obviously working in that field and traveling around to different communities and talking with different people, I have always tended to try to understand and like I said, tried to almost play that mediator role. But right after Trump was elected, I had a trip up to a small town up in Washington, and I was leading a trip with some other folks from the city.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of what I do. And we stopped at a gas station, and people were getting out, and there was this notably somber mood in the car. You know, it was right after people were feeling hurt, people were feeling upset,
right.
worried. And then I was looking around, and I'm seeing Trump stickers on trucks, people going this way and that, smiling, waving hello, going to get a coffee, getting gas.
Having a pretty good day.
And I just had a realization at that moment, like these people that I'm seeing right here, they're experiencing something completely different from what I'm experiencing at this moment, and they're feeling heard. And I think at that moment I started to more fully understand that over the past 8.5 years or 8 years, they just didn't feel heard or that they mattered. And I know that's been talked about a decent amount after the Trump election, but to experience that in kind of a visual and an emotional moment was powerful for me, because I was happy for them, which was interesting, because the election of Trump I thought was a step towards further division and just a dangerous and also just less ideal situation for our country. And but at that moment I felt completely different. So it was a powerful learning experience for myself.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's a story worth telling. So one thing I'm interested in hearing you sort of dissect for us a little bit from your own vantage point is the kind of the particular state of, I guess, broadly speaking, the two major ideological camps in American political society, and these sort of, the way the cultures are developing therein, and what the particular features of each may be relative to what contributes to our current state of polarization. So maybe this is a little easier for you to analyze going in a leftward direction, but I invite your commentary on both. But to start out with, we have the progressive movement and the conservative movement. Very simplistic way of putting it, because there's all sorts of variations on each side. But what is it within progressive culture today, contemporaneously, that you think may be sort of coming off kilter in a manner that might be damaging to our civic culture, exacerbating the divide? And then we'll take the conservative side too and see what you think about that end of things as well.
Yeah. I think the dominating feature that relates to what you're bringing up is just a lack of respect and understanding from the left, from some on the left, toward many that might feel differently than them. So that could be other folks on the left that are speaking in ways that are deemed inappropriate, or just a general discounting of conservative thinking, as if it's all either greedy or self-centered or racist or whatever. I mean, there's the various ways you can view all those perspectives, and I think it seems all too easy for many on the left to just jump to one of those labels. And I think that does a disservice to a broader understanding, does a disservice to building a bigger tent, as you would say, for their own perspectives and their own party. And it does a disservice to the people that they're disrespecting, of course.
Yeah. Do you look at that as being in any way different on the right, or is it basically just sort of the same culture of divisiveness? I guess that part of what I'm getting to with this point is I sort of look at the left and the right as pivoting from different prejudices that may be leading to the same place in many respects. And I say this as a person who actually spent a great deal of time in his life. Well, first of all, I come from a more liberal background as well. I mean, I come from a very much a multicultural family and an extremely multicultural school district and an extremely multicultural city. I'm from LA, but I was raised in Culver City, California, which is even multicultural and progressive by Los Angeles standards, so to speak. That said, I did have some philosophical diversity in my family. I had both, I could argue, sort of white and black conservatives, or at least traditionalists in my family growing up as well. And I tend to think that, let's see, how can I articulate this? I tend to think that on the progressive side, there is a tendency to look at things in the through a frame that says that, well, there's an oppressive history here in the United States of America that has relegated certain groups of people to a marginalized sort of place on the on the social hierarchy, and therefore we have to, in a default sort of way, look at people who have look at people who are part of the dominant group, which, you can describe as, broadly speaking, Anglo, broadly speaking, capitalist, broadly speaking, Christian, and broadly speaking, male, as being sort of the purveyors of this broad, and beneficiaries of this broad iniquity. And, I can understand the historical basis for that perspective, because in a very general sense, I mean, we know that the United States of America was founded by wealthy white men who were, frequently Christian or otherwise had a Christian vision of God and so forth. But when you take that broad conceptualization and whittle it down to our relationships with individual people, then all of a sudden you're painting most people with the brush. I mean, most, people who fit in those categories with the brush that they don't deserve to be painted with. And then on the right, on the other hand, I feel that many conservatives have this sense of folks on the left, and certainly many minorities, and by not just racial minorities, but people of different religious and maybe sexual orientations and political perspectives and so forth, as being people who share this broad-based antipathy for the American experiment itself. And, there's some historical basis, I find, for that too, at least in as much as, naturally, people who are not as traditionally rooted in some of the founding precepts of the American experiment. Say if you're an immigrant, or you're a person with a much different religious perspective, you're not necessarily going to connect with all of these themes in the same way. And certainly people who have a history of being, oppressed or marginalized aren't going to romanticize American history quite so much. And so, there is some reason, I think, to suspect that there's some cultural strain historically on the left that is maybe even hypercritical of American tradition and so forth. But nevertheless, if you operate from the presupposition that all left-leaning people hate America, it's a really bad way of trying to engage people who actually do share so many values and concerns, I think. And I think you can too, with folks on the right. So that's kind of how I'm sort of decoding the strange there. And so I'm just wondering if those kind of themes resonate with your analysis of the particulars of, the right and left wing contributions to polarization.
Yeah, it's similar, I think, in many ways. I definitely agree with what you were saying, and I think that perspective is accurate. I think it's a little different in that it seems like from the right toward the left, it's more of a dismissiveness. Like, you're not smart, you don't understand how things work. So it's a different type of labeling or shaming and kind of disrespect, but
right.
So they don't quite mirror each other, but I think they do have the same end result of just driving people away and doing little to build a bigger tent and to build a better understanding for themselves. Because it's like, it's often very divisive too. So
Right. Yeah, well, no doubt about it. One thing I find to be very important, and I think that it's probably not a common focus among political pundits, which is part of the problem. But I do think that it's sort of a hallmark of the rhetoric and the type of thinking that characterized the approach of many of America's, and just globally speaking, many of history's greater social and political leaders, is to sort of graduate from the language of political debate, let's say, or political polemics, to the language of I think moral transcendence, if you will. And certainly, for myself, as I've said many times previously, my great icon growing up was Martin Luther King Jr., a person who was politically liberal, I think it's fair to say, all in all, but also a person who emphasized the fact that the real transformative power in a society and for people who seek to change the world in a positive way is not intellectual opinions so much with respect to the particulars of economic or political policy, although those things are very important to be certain, but rather is our broader commitment to a moral and virtuous way of being, particularly that which is expressed in this idea of loving your neighbor as you love yourself, and utilizing the power of love as a transformational value and force in human interaction, and both individually and collectively. And so part of what I'm interested in hearing from you is how you look at the sort of art or practice of being a moral person, if you will. How do you define that in your own experience? And maybe say a little bit about what experiences lead you to your own particular understanding of what it is to be moral and virtuous and good, or what it is to strive for those things in human behavior.
Yeah, I've thought about this, obviously, as most people have, quite a bit. And I come from a scientific background. My dad was a scientist, and we did not have a religious household. And so bringing morality, and I know they don't have to be intricately tied, but often they are. And that's how I guess I've thought about it. In how does one formulate morality outside of that, when that's such the dominant form of framing morality for most, at least most conversations.
And there is a secular effort today, and I think a long-standing one, actually. It's not just contemporary.
Yeah.
But to provide another framework for being able to, or at least a complementary framework for being able to discuss these sorts of issues that's, has scientific integrity and doesn't necessarily need to be tethered to a religious parlance.
Yeah. And I think it's at least for myself, maybe more difficult to outline because it comes down to the individual and your own accountability. And so, I mean, that's how I tend to view things. I tend to hold myself to standards, whatever the case may be, and morality is the same. And but I think I think it can be applying it to a bigger scale, I think is tough. I think it becomes less of a individual accountability, more of a community accountability. And so I guess tying ourselves to our evolutionary ropes that make us better people in the eyes of our community. I think that's how I start to see that if you take it higher than the individual. Right. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but that's kind of that's what it brought up for me, and that's how I view that in this part of the conversation.
Well, it definitely speaks to something that I think is important in that vein. And as a matter of fact, Adam Smith, the philosopher Adam Smith, who most people know is the author of The Wealth of Nations, he also wrote a comprehensive compendium of moral observations, moral philosophy, prior to that, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, one of his basic positions is that we conduct ourselves morally and find ourselves sort of, I guess, ascending to a higher place of moral clarity or resolution within our own conscience and behavior, by sort of reflecting within our own minds back on some sort of outside observer. He wasn't necessarily arguing that there was a God looking at us by any means, but he was simply saying that part of the way we evaluate ourselves morally in an internal way is by imagining, even if subconsciously, how external observers would perceive us and so forth. And so that would tend to sort of reflect out into our actual relationships with a broader community and so forth. So I definitely think that that's a key observation that you make with respect to that. But yeah, I mean, I would have to imagine that part of what motivates anybody to want to build bridges in our society is a sense that it is sort of a moral mission ultimately. Mm-hmm. And at least for myself, it's useful to describe it that way because I do think, and it does get a little bit back to an observation you made earlier, which is the fact that there's sort of this intrinsic energy of intensity that comes along with a more strictly divisive way of talking about things.
Yeah,
that gets a lot of attention and that gets things moving in a quick way, even if it's chaotic and counterproductive. But I don't know if there's really kind of a language of centrism per se or of moderation that can have that same effect. But I do think that it may be that even if it winds up being sort of a synthesis or a harmonizing of traditionally religious and secular humanistic sort of language, that there may be a moral language that perhaps we're in the process of discovering that might allow us to sort of rise to counteract and to rise above the energy of that traditionally polarizing rhetoric, a language of morality, which I think that Dr. King, and I think you could say similar things about John Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln and others, but I think that Dr. King demonstrated in his eloquence and his sort of grandiose, in his grand but also earnest and sincere sort of, moral oratory. I think that it is possible for a more sort of ethically grounded language to transcend and to go beyond the power of crass political polarization and sophistry and so forth. Yeah. So I guess that's what I'm getting at. And I guess picking up off of that, I would ask you, do you think that there may be any value in a project like that? Because the way I see the work of Better Angels and Bridging Our Divide and other groups similar to ours, perhaps Listen First and others, is that whether we're conscious of it or not, I think we are kind of striving to find that common language that can allow for people from across the spectrum with admittedly different native tongues and native experiences to begin to communicate in such a way to where we can readily see these common values. But the current language we have, I don't think presents that much opportunity. So what do you think of looking at what it is we're doing in the context of sort of a project of language, of moral language itself, if you will? How does that strike you?
It's not a lens that I normally use, to be honest. That's not to say it's not applicable. It's not the way I normally see it, although it might be the same thing. I tend to see it as a greater understanding of respect and empathy for those that are different from us, and a broader and more dedicated vision of unity, and not disclusionary unity, but unity for unity's sake.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I certainly think that language isn't sufficient to allow us to accomplish that unity if there's not the undergirding foundation of those principles which you articulated here just to begin with, which is respect and empathy. And, I would certainly add compassion and I use the term love but I define that as Dr. King defined it in a social context, which is really just to say an overarching goodwill, even for people who don't necessarily return it to you, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's where I land. Are there some particular thinkers or public figures out there who you think are steering the conversation in the right direction today, who are broadly recognized? I mean, people who, you know, perhaps are getting us to think in directions that transcend the traditional polarization, that have influenced you personally?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few. I guess I would say I have a little hesitation with identifying various ones because I have take certain issue with various aspects of what I glean from lots of different speakers or people. I'll just say one person that early on inspired me in a way in similar work is Jonathan Haidt. Obviously, you know who he is because I think he's really
he's on the board of directors at Better Angels. Been a big influence on myself as well.
Yeah, and I found that book, Righteous Mind, to be fantastic and interesting. I'd like to see a deeper dive into certain aspects of it. Maybe that's on the in the future here, but
yeah. Well, he talks about the different moral foundations of left and right and so forth.
Right. I find that to be fascinating, and I feel like if there were more people in the country digging into that kind of introspection and societal I guess commentary, I think it'd be pretty valuable for us because it allows you to take a step back and to look at things through a different lens. I think there's a lot of value in that. Yeah.
Well, you know, social media and perhaps the way the internet has affected communication in general has received a lot of attention for its tendency to perpetuate and accentuate divides that may have already been there, but are now, you know, more easily amplified through all sorts of features of that phenomenon.
And likely stronger, I would say, just due to the fact that if you can only get something across in a few words or an image or a meme, you're likely going to go for the jugular or go for the us and them.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. And, you know, as Sam Harris frequently remarks upon the weakness of email as a communication medium, just in as much as there's so much lost when all you have is text in front of you. And I find this with myself too. If I'm exchanging emails with somebody, it's very easy for me to read something as being a little bit curt when it probably wasn't, you know?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I frequently have trouble deciding for myself whether or not I should put an exclamation point or a period at the sentence, because sometimes I want to convey, sometimes I want to convey a positive tone, right? But an exclamation point seems a little too cheery, but then a period seems like a little too nonchalant somehow. Like,
here's
I don't
my statement, take it or leave it.
Yeah. Exactly, you know. But where was I going with that? Oh, yeah. Where I was going with that was in saying, you know, at the same time, the internet has afforded us, and, you know, part of the purpose of Better Angels Media is ultimately to, you know, to build upon this space of opportunity here. The internet has afforded us an avenue for highlighting and distributing and promoting deeper conversations along the lines of certainly the types of conversations that Jonathan Haidt has been having, and a lot of the dialogues that we see in the zone that people are calling the intellectual dark web, just for example, where folks have, in a way that probably never really was possible on cable television or traditional news and so forth, people are able to have long-form conversations, really kind of like the dialogue you and I are having right now, where we can go deep on the dynamics and nuance of various subjects, and they don't necessarily have to be easily packaged or easily marketed to a conventional kind of political perspective. It seems like there's a lot more space for depth and individuality. in the new medium. And I'm hoping that perhaps, to even granted all the ways in which, social media and the internet has been vehicles for polarization, that nevertheless, perhaps it also brings with it the antidote to its own virus, so to speak. So I wonder what you feel about that general
Yeah,
idea.
I think there's some opportunity there. I think that type of conversation and that type of, I guess, media, you would say, does have the potential to do the same thing as far as division, but it's just in a different way.
Right.
So I do think there's some hope there, and there's a growing awareness about how the contemptuous atmosphere is not helpful, and I think that growing awareness is more than anything going to be what pushes things to a better place.
Right.
But you can see the digging of polarization trenches in long form discussions and those types of media, and you can see people missing opportunities for building a better bridge, and Sam Harris is a good example. There's he's obviously someone that promotes conversation and conversation on difficult issues, but some could say maybe he could do a better job of recognizing the value of the perspectives of those that he disagrees with, and kind of outlining that more fully to dissipate and diffuse some of the disagreements. So I just highlight that as an example, because it's something that's been circled around on social media and media recently.
Yeah, well, I wrote, not to plug myself, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. I wrote an article for Ario magazine called, I think I called it "Sam Harris, Ezra Klein, and the Politicization of Science." And I don't know if you saw that piece, or if you listened to their debate on their.
I did. I didn't see the piece. I didn't know you wrote that. I saw the. I listened to the debate. It was tough.
It was, well, I
He's
thought
the moderator.
Kind of did need a moderator, I think. Well, actually, I thought it was a fascinating conversation, because I do think that both Sam Harris and Ezra Klein are extremely intelligent individuals. There's no question about that from my perspective. And, if we had more time here, we could go into more of the nuances of their disagreements, because there were many. And yet, I think what stands out most to me, I wrote the article about the politicization of science. I thought that they were basically arguing over what it means to politicize science, because I thought that Klein was sort of suggesting that Murray and Harris were politicizing the subject by not recognizing its political implications, and Harris seemed to be thinking that Klein and Turk, I forget the names
Turkheimer.
of the Turkheimer and company, that they are politicizing it by essentially mischaracterizing the intentions, or applying malignant intentions to people who are just engaging in objective research, right? And I sort of sided a bit more with Harris in that conversation. But nevertheless, to your point, I think that that was an example of a very long conversation with two intelligent individuals who largely failed to converge on a more fundamental moral level. And so in that sense, I completely agree with you that even in this space, there's still plenty of room for new and maybe even more pernicious divides to open up. But I do think that there is sort of an objective, or at least an overriding value to just the depth of the conversation itself, because even though you still have that same potential for pitfalls and for polarizing pitfalls, just the very length and commitment to clarifying those disagreements, even where no agreement is ultimately reached, I think it still allows for people like you and me to look at it from the outside and to have a better opportunity to see just what exactly may have gone wrong, so we can maybe come back and, do it better ourselves in our own conversations. And I don't think that you really get that so much with the 5-minute, or the 8-minute cable news talking head battles. It's like, I mean, watching Fox News and MSNBC, I'll still do it, but it just gives you a headache at some point. Just
Yeah.
when you get those kinds of dialogues where people are just shouting generalizations at each other, and then it's like, well, what did I learn? Nothing other than the fact that people on the news really act like jerks sometimes,
Yeah.
And so
Both goes.
maybe that's the upside here.
Yeah, I think it is important to hear two people, even if they aren't coming together, especially if it is two like that, which is I thought was particularly fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, explain their perspectives a little more. In that conversation, for instance, to hear Ezra Klein's his issues, and kind of once he got past the talking points and what he had clearly scripted to put across.
Yeah.
To kind of hear some of his concerns, I think is valuable, and likewise with Sam Harris. But even though he seems to state them maybe more clearly up front. So, yeah, but I mean, just to see that though, I mean, I feel like you could have 10 people listening to that conversation and hearing 5 people hearing one thing and 5 hearing another, and yet everybody going away recognizing that there was no coming together. And I guess that's part of the motivation of the Common Ground debates and things like that, is that having a third party can make a big difference. They were both, what is it, like by hosting their event,
right.
their podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know what you'd call that, but and so you could say that's a neutral territory, but bringing somebody on as to interview, it's just a different environment, because you have a referee, like you had brought up with the musician earlier. Having a referee there, I think, can make a big difference, because you have question posed, question not answered, question posed, and a question not answered. That doesn't get us very far. That, if anything, just frustrates everybody.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, related to the point about language, I mean, I think that at the center of all this is a realization that there is definitely a better way for us to have conversations. And certainly I think Bridging Our Divide is leading the charge in many respects in terms of modeling a better way to have these challenging discourses. And so I'm happy to be a modest part of that. And I very much thank you for the work that you're doing, Shiloh. It's been a privilege to get to know you a little bit over these last few weeks, and I'm definitely looking forward to our time together in Portland. Before we sign off here, I have a quick question, and then after you answer it, I invite you to leave us with any thoughts or information. But what do you hope to see come out of this broader, I'll call it the depolarization movement? There's no official name for it, but I'll just put that out there. What do you hope to see come out of the broader sort of depolarization movement going forward, and in part as a result of your own actions?
Just simply put, a better sense of unity, that we're all in this together, and that what serves someone else serves yourself. It's the same, and it's not generally not a zero-sum game. So,
gotcha.
A better sense of unity, I think, would make a huge difference.
Yes, sir. And where can our audience find you and follow your work and follow the work of Bridging Our Divide? And is there anything else you want to tell us about it?
No, I'll just leave you with the website, which is bridgingourdivide.org, and we're on Twitter at Bridge Our Divide. And that's a good way to kind of learn more about what we're doing and what's on the horizon.
There you go. The event coming up in Portland is featuring Robin Johnson, correct? Brett Weinstein, the biologist, and known from the Evergreen State scandal. His wife, Heather Hare. And who's the fourth guest?
And then Michael Parkhurst.
Right.
So Michael Parkhurst and Robin Johnson, they both work for nonprofits in the Portland area. Nonprofits revolving loosely around social justice work. Robin's more than Michael's, and then moderated by you.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Which I think you as a moderator is just a perfect fit in so many different ways. Obviously, your work with Better Angels and your own podcast, and the Wood Review in the past and maybe future, and obviously your interests, and I think your knowledge of the kind of the subject and the participants. You've written, I read your article about identity politics. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
And I think, it's just I was excited that you were interested and able to make that happen.
Yeah, well, I'm honored by the request. It's definitely a step up in the world for me.
It's gonna be a challenge. It's gonna be an experiment. I mean, that's one thing we need to put across at the event, and
sure,
to ourselves that, I mean, this is it's a new thing to some extent, and I think it'll be it's unscripted. We don't know how it will go, but I think that's also part of the excitement.
I would definitely say so. We have no idea what to expect, and that's probably what's going to make it a good time. So, Shiloh Halsey, thank you so much for joining us on Transcending Politics, and look forward to having this conversation again.
Great, thanks.